What's up, hobby friends, and welcome to my video tutorial on how to paint Marvel Crisis Protocol Gamora from Atomic Mass Games. So I've got the colors and paints I've used on this model up on screen now. If you want to give those a check out, you can pause the video, note those down, and then we can dive right on into the tutorial. So the model itself is fairly unremarkable when it comes to the actual build. A lot of the seams for torso halves and where the legs join the body are hidden by where the armor plates overlap or where there are joins or seams in between the plates. So there's not a lot of gap filling you really need to do. I haven't chosen to sub-assembly anything either, largely because I can just do the dry brushing on the base and then I can use some painter's tape and some blue tack to mask it off when I go back to do some airbrushing on the model and then do some of my whatever other painting. So we're going to prime the model black, and then I'm going to paint the base off camera. This will be for my client, and I've actually done a tutorial on the techniques and colors I've used for the base. So if you want to check that out, I'll have a link in the video description below. So I'm going to start with some airbrush base coats, starting with a medium sea gray. You can see that I've masked off the base so I don't overspray onto what's already painted. I'm going to start applying this base coat onto areas where there is the white armor. You can do this by hand, but I find that airbrushing these first few coats allows for an easy buildup of the shadow and midtones and smoother highlights. From there, I'll do a nice zenithal with warm gray. And because of the way that Gamora is angled, you want to focus this really on the upper parts of the arms, torso, and her legs. And then finally, I'll do a 50-50 mix of warm gray and pale sand and really focus in on the tops of her shoulders, arms, and in particular, her left knee and thigh. Once I've done the airbrushing, I'm going to go back in with some black, and I'm going to black line the black suit. So this is the one disadvantage to doing the airbrush base coat, is it is a little bit more tedious doing this black part, but I feel the trade-off to get nice, clean, crisp white armor very worth it. Just take your time and dilute your paints. Once the black lining on the suit is done, I can go back in with pure pale sand and start to highlight the armor. The reason I did the black lining before this as well is I can use this step to now correct up and sharpen the edges where the black may have overpainted. My next highlight on the armor will be with greenish white, and with this I really want to make sure that I'm focusing on sharp edges, corners, parts where I really want the armor to shine, and the trick at this stage now is to really dilute your paints as well. I find that greenish white and white, because of the way that the pigments tend to clump, you want to make sure that you're really diluting your colors and building up your layers very slowly. You don't want to try and slap on the white highlights too quickly or too fast. You want to be able to build up your colors slowly and gradually. It helps to get that smooth blend, but also that very nice, smooth, flat finish. And then finally, I'll use some pure white. This is going to be very sparing. I focused this on the uppermost corners of the armor, particularly on the thighs. We're looking at the top of the chest, her plates covering the breasts, as well as the upper arms. I find that good looking white really lives in the mid and shadow tones. Too much white can actually draw away from the color and the depth of the material. So for this, very sparing, less is more. Once the white armor is done, we can go back in to do the black suit. I'm going to start with some ash gray and just apply some blocky highlights to sketch in where the lights are going to begin to form on the black suit. You can definitely do this step before polishing the white armor. The sequencing really isn't that important. And then from there, dark sea gray to continue doing some more of the highlighting. I'm being pretty rough with this because I want the suit to have a bit of a pseudo shiny leather feel, so I don't need my blends to be perfectly smooth. And then of course afterwards I'll go back in with some diluted black and just do a few glazes to knock back some of those transitions and have a bit more smoothness in the suit. Much like with the white, you want to make sure that you're just diluting your colors and building up your layers slowly and gradually. To paint the red elements of the suit, I'm going to start with a base coat of reddish black. Particularly on the white armored elements, you want to be careful not to overpaint onto the white, as correcting can be pretty difficult. And then from there, it's just a matter of highlighting through the colors, first with burnt red. And you can see that particularly on the sides. You want to be creating that blend front to back. The highlight colors, as you go up, particularly into the blood red, and then the next colors, scarlet red and amaranth red, do tend to get more into the orange. I find that blood red sits right in that middle tone, so a lot of the midtones are going to live in this blood red area. And my next two highlights of the scarlet red and the amaranth red, I will use very sparingly. Again, too much of these last two colors will turn the red orange as opposed to staying red. So you want to make sure that you're using these colors very sparingly to do final pop highlights and like ultra contrast. But really, blood red is where that color is going to live. I'm going to apply a base coat of dark sea blue over her hair, her face, as well as the blade. Pretty much any area that's going to be green or non-metal silver. I'm going to start with the face, building it up first with dark green. What I initially thought about for the skin tone was to build up through the sort of greenish yellows, but I found that as I was working it through, I was losing a bit of that skin tone that I really liked from the MCU films. So what I ended up doing at this next step was I introduced a bit of Harvester Flesh from scale 75 to add a bit of that peach tone into the brightest highlights especially, before going back in with a mix of green and yellow to focus on areas like the eyebrows, the nose, and the cheekbones to bring back some of that greenish yellow from our mid and shadow tone. With this Gamora model in particular, I feel like because of how I feel the armor and the suit is relatively plain, because it's just shades or tones of black and white, the only real color on this model are the red elements of the suit and then her face and her hair. So you really want to spend a lot of that time to make sure that your colors are really punchy, get that nice contrast in there. I feel like a well-painted face and hair on this Gamora model makes or breaks this model. So you can see here, this final highlight is a mix of that Moonray Flesh, which is sort of this almost sickly bone color, with a bit of that Harvester Flesh, which lives more in that peach tone, and then a bit of that green tone. And I'm focusing this on the cheekbones, the nose, eyebrows, and foreheads. A trick with painting female faces or faces that are younger is to not overdo the wrinkles or creases. The more wrinkles or creases or folds that you add or accentuate, the older and more masculine a face looks. So you want to be very sparing and make sure that your highlights and blends are relatively smooth and you're not over exaggerating certain facial features, in particular the jowls and the corners around the eyes and the mouth. So here I was using a bit of violet red mixed in with the green to add a bit of shading around the eyes. I added a bit of rosiness to the lips. And then in this final step, as I mentioned before, I'm just mixing in a bit of yellow into my green to bring back some of those rich tones, particularly in the cheeks. I really like the way that they painted the studio artwork, and I wanted to mimic that on this model. Once the face is done, I'll go back in and do the green for the hair. I basically took the same colors I did the midtones initially on the skin with, just to have a bit of commonality. But then in my final highlights, I took it a bit more into that pastel tone using a scale color. And this was to help create a bit of differentiation between the face and the hair. I made sure to also have a lot more of those mid and shadow tones in the hair, and I used my highlights very sparingly, particularly on the bangs in the front, as well as the crease on the top of the head where the hair folds or hair parting meets. But for the most part, when you look at the face as composed or compared to the hair overall is a lot darker in value, where the face is a lot brighter. So using similar colors, I still ended up with a bit of separation between the tone just by using contrast. Paint the eyes, I'm using black and scale colors white sands. I started with a bit of blacklining to fill in the socket. And then to paint the eyes, there's two ways you can do about it. So I painted the left eye different from the right. You can do a white dot to do the entire pupil, and then a black dot to do the dot. Or you can do two white dots to paint the eye right away if you're comfortable with that, and then cleaning up as necessary. Depending on the size of the eye and whichever you're comfortable with, either method works. I use both interchangeably depending on the particular model and whether I can do it in just the 2 dots or whether I have to do the full white dot first and then going back in and adding in the black dot. And then once you've painted the eyes, go back in with your greens and your yellow tones and just correct any overpaints on the cheeks and the eyebrows. Paint the sword, as already mentioned, I did a base coat with the dark sea blue when I was painting the hair and the skin. And then from there, I'm doing a couple of quick blends through a variety of blues and gray blues. So starting with a mix of dark sea blue and gray blue, I start by sketching in some rough values onto the sword. Throughout this entire process, I'm just being careful not to overpaint into the crevices. I want to make sure that I'm leaving those dark shadows and crevices in the sword in the dark sea blue. Being a little bit neater here is just cleaner, and it makes the entire painting process a lot easier than having to go back in afterwards and correct by blacklining with dark sea blue. You may overpaint onto your highlights and have to correct those, and it's a lot of back and forth. Where I feel being neater at the start is just easier overall. So once I've hit pure gray blue, I'm going to go in with pure spectrum blue. And I'm not going for a perfect smooth blend at this stage now. I want to introduce a bit of chipping and weathering on the sword, add a bit of character and some battle damage. So with a bit of a diluted paint, I'm combination doing a bit of feathering, but also fading out with these lines to simulate chips and scratches on the surface before I go back in and edge highlight all the raised edges. I'll do the same thing with pure greenish white, and from here, and then my next final highlight of white, I'm keeping my paints nice and diluted so that we're avoiding that chalkiness, just like with the armor, but also helps us with fading and smoothing out any sort of rough transitions. A useful trick to doing the edges is to use the side of the brush and not the tip, and to drag your brush along to pull the paint on the edge. To paint the non-metal hilt of the blade, we're going to start with some Vallejo's Burnt Umber, which I've already applied as a base coat, and then from there, it's just a progressive highlight through English uniform, Japanese uniform World War II, pale yellow, and pastel yellow. Now, because the gold on this miniature, there's not a lot of flat surfaces, there's no big areas to have to blend. I'm not really worrying about intermediary steps. I'm pretty much just working through each of these colors in turn, one after another. I do dilute my colors a little bit so that as I'm layering up, I can fake a few of those transition steps. But for the most part, as you can see, as I'm highlighting up, the highlights are fairly sudden and the jumps are almost immediate without much care to the transition. For this, it's more the illusion of the material, and what I'm really looking to achieve or capture here is the high contrast between my brights and my darks, and making sure that my edges have really sharp, crisp highlights. For a tabletop piece like this, especially on these fine details, the impression of the material I think is just as valuable, if not more so, than spending forever making sure that you have perfect blends. If this were a competition piece or something for display, I would definitely spend a lot more time working on the transitions. But I think for a tabletop piece where your viewing is from 3, 4, or 5 feet away, this quick and dirty approach is definitely worth considering because of how much faster it is. And then finally, I'm going to wrap up this model with a couple of airbrush glazes. You can do this glazing by hand, but I find that the airbrush is quicker, smoother, and I have a little bit more consistency in getting a nice fade very easily. So I'm going to start with some Aethermatic Blue, focusing mainly on the armor to get a bit of that sort of ivory ceramic feel. You can really see that I'm really pushing it in the shadows, particularly under the thighs, under the legs, and underneath the torso armor. Any sort of overspray on the black suit or on the red or on the skin, because the color itself is fairly thin, it's not going to overpower it, and it just adds a bit more color information and variety to the materials. And then finally, I'll finish up with some Druchii Violet in a similar manner. For this, I've got it diluted about 50-50 water and flow improver, to the actual paint itself, and I'm being very careful not to spray too heavily, in particular on the white armor. I want to make sure that I'm hitting up those deep shadows, being very soft with this, but not, again, overdoing it on the white. Otherwise, you end up making it too purple, which I'm not a huge fan of. And that will wrap up this miniature. I painted the base trim black, and I applied a matte varnish. For this, I used Mr. Hobby's Super Clear because this is a gaming piece. I want to make sure that it's going to handle up to handling and gameplay for my client. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you give it a like and subscribe for more awesome weekly content. If you want to check out my other social media platforms, I'll make sure to have links in the video description below. And again, I'll have a link on how to paint the base in the description below, as well as I do have a more in-depth tutorial on the recipes and techniques for that. That's it. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy hobbying.